conversation around the referendum. Before we get started though, I want to both introduce myself and we have a number of school board members here tonight, so I'm going to give the school board members an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm Rich Dahman, the superintendent, and board members, if you want to one at a time, you stand and wave and introduce yourselves so that you folks know who's here from the school board.
I'm Rick Mullen, board vice president. Thanks for coming.
Mike Hoffman, thanks for being here tonight. Dave Alterman, thanks for being here.
Jennifer Jones.
John Doomer, thanks for being here.
So we have 5 of our school board members here tonight. A few of our admin team are here. And as you came in, you could have picked up an information sheet. We're going to go through a presentation that contains some of the same things that are on the fact sheet. And I'll refer to those as we go through. But wanted to share some information with folks. As you know, coming up on Tuesday, April 4th is Election Day. And the board has approved bringing an operating referendum question to the voters on Tuesday, April 4th. And my job is to make sure that people in our school district have accurate information about the proposed referendum so that they can make an informed decision as they vote. I'm not here to say vote yes or vote no, but I'm very happy to answer questions and provide information for folks. Our school district is very much an essential part of our community, and in a number of different ways. We have very strong student achievement, including being named the #1 school district in Rock County by Niche. We have excellent opportunities for all students, both in academic opportunities and extracurricular opportunities. We have an outstanding staff. We're one of the largest employers in the district. And we balance providing a high-quality education and opportunities for students with being fiscal stewards of our taxpayers' money. One of the reasons that our school district and school districts across the state are looking at potentially bringing operating referendums to the voters is the format that the state uses to fund public schools. On this chart, it goes back to 95-96 all the way through this current year, and you can see through the mid to late 90s all the way up to about 2009 or 2010, the state of Wisconsin had a very uniform, consistent manner for funding public education across the state. What's being measured here is the Wisconsin revenue limit per pupil adjustment history. So these are the adjustments that were made on a yearly basis per pupil to school districts across the state to that revenue limit. And what that did back then was it allowed school districts to plan for some consistent increases as inflationary costs continue to rise. There was increased funding available for schools. Well, you'll see out in the middle of this graph around 2009, 2010, that system of funding schools by the state made a pretty dramatic change. You can see the 2 years in the middle where there were still increases, but there were lower increases, and it got out of that pattern of increasing or regular increases. And then in the 2011-2012 year, a very significant decrease in that revenue limit adjustment. And since then, the increases have either been quite low or non-existent, including 6 of the last 8 years where there hasn't been any increase to the revenue limit, including the past 2 years. So school districts across the state have been facing this looming fiscal cliff as inflationary costs continue to rise, and revenue from the state clearly hasn't stayed caught up with those inflationary costs. That revenue limit caps the amount of money that districts can receive. And what's happening because of that change at the state level is it's really shifting the funding of public schools from the state to more local support. And how school districts are addressing that is that in this past year, there are 92 different school districts across the state that asked their local taxpayers for additional operating funds through an operational referendum. 76 of those 92 were successful, and those took place in either April of 22 or November of 22. And then this coming April, our school district, along with 51 others, so a total of 52 school districts in the state, are pursuing an operating referendum. So it's becoming more and more a need for school districts across the state to have to look for operating funds from their local taxpayers. One of the things that the school board looked at as we were considering both our financial situation as a school district and in addition to the state funding is how do we compare to other school districts, both in our area and in our conference. We're in the Badger Conference, so the next two slides include comparisons of total revenue per member. So membership is a way that the school tracks funds that go out to the schools. It's not exactly the same as enrollment because it includes different weighted scores depending on what grade level students are in, and it includes an adjustment for summer school. But in general, this shows, in comparison to the state and in comparison to other school districts, what does our revenue look like compared to others. You can see across the bottom here, all of the different school districts in the Badger Conference. In the bars, the blue represents property tax funding. The yellow represents federal funding, so that's a relatively small portion of ours and every school district's revenue. The green represents state funding, and the orange on the top is a small amount that represents local non-tax revenue. That could be fees or admission charges for people attending events and things like that. And as you look at this example and the next one that compares us with other Rock County school districts, in both cases you'll see that our school district is on the farthest right. We have the lowest revenue per member of any of those comparable school districts at about just a shade over $14,300. You can see the average of the Badger Conference school districts is about $15,700 or a little over that. And the state average is just a shade under $17,000 per member. So when you multiply that by our number of students or our membership, you can see that that's a pretty significant amount of money that other school districts have as revenue, and then the ability to utilize that to pay their staff, run their programs, purchase supplies, a significant amount of revenue that other districts have that we don't have. So the next slide is measuring the same thing, but it's a comparison to other Rock County school districts. And you can see here again, the other school districts in Rock County, the same, different colors in the graph. Our average is the same, the state average is the same. The Rock County average is very similar to the average from the Badger Conference schools. It's about $1,400, a little over $1,400, or excuse me, a little bit under $1,400 per member when we compare ours to the average for the county. So as the school board looked at those different things, one of the things we've talked about over the past few years as we've seen this coming is, what are some ways that we can become more efficient as a school district? Because we really work hard to balance that providing a high quality education and opportunities for students, but we balance it with living within our means. And our means are the lowest revenue in Rock County and the lowest revenue in the Badger Conference. So we've had to work very hard to look for ways to become more efficient. Here are some different things that we've done over the past few years to increase our efficiency, both in the short term and in the long term. I won't go through that list, you can read that list, but you can see that there's a number of things that we've done to look for ways to be as efficient as possible as a school district. When all of those things are taken together, the frozen revenue limits that we talked about earlier, the increasing inflationary costs, whether that's for staffing, transportation, heating, property and medical insurance costs continue to rise, supply and equipment costs. And when we look at those two things, our money coming in and our expenses, in order to have a balanced budget, it's going to require either new revenue or significant spending reductions. The only way that we can balance our budget in the face of our situation right now is one of those two ways. And we know that significant spending reductions would have a large impact on our students and our schools and our staff. and opportunities for students. We'd be facing significantly larger class sizes, fewer academic and extracurricular opportunities for students. We'd have to look for ways to reduce a significant amount of money from our budget if the referendum doesn't pass. And this graph demonstrates our budget forecast for the upcoming years. And this is on the handout that you have too. The blue line here in the middle represents our projected revenues. Starting with next year on the far left, the 23-24 year, going out 4 years to the 26-27 year. And you can see that those remain relatively steady. Those do include a projected $125 increase in the per pupil adjustment from the state. We're hopeful that the state will provide additional funding for our schools. The legislature will be determining that for this coming biennium. They probably won't have an answer to that until June or July at the earliest. So we made a projection and used a $125 increase per pupil each of those years. But if you remember that first slide and on the handout, that doesn't match the history from the state. The state over the last 10 or more years hasn't made that level of increases. The other thing that's projected here is in the orange line are our projected expenses, and we used a 3% projected growth each year. And that's tied to those increased inflationary costs. We know that inflationary costs are considerably higher than that right now. As an example, our medical insurance premium is going up by 6.9%, or likely to go up by 6.9% next year, and then even more than that in coming years. But if we kept our expense costs to a 3% increase each of those years, we have our projected shortfall each year. So for this coming year, projected shortfall of about $2.72 million. That would grow to a little bit over $4 million in 24-25, grow by a little bit more than another million to about $5.24 million in 25-26. And the reason that the revenue has a significant decrease going from 25-26 to 26-27 is that we currently, baked into our current revenues all the way across this, is a $2.5 million non-recurring referendum that's in place for 3 more years, and then it expires, so that would reduce our incoming revenue by $2.5 million. So the projected shortfall out in the 4th year in 26-27 is about $8.83 million. As the school board looked at that and kept in mind that the importance of having a balanced budget, and in order to have a balanced budget, either new revenue or significant cuts across our programs, the school board proposed a recurring referendum that would gradually increase the district's operational resources by a total of $9.5 million over 4 years to protect our programs, services, and to allow us to attract, retain, and remain competitive for educators and staff. An important piece of that is that the net levy increase of that referendum would be $1 million per year over each of the next 4 years. And there's a slide coming up that speaks to that. Before I go to that slide though, I want to talk a little bit about that being able to attract and retain high quality staff. In all my years in education, this current climate is the most difficult for hiring people. And all of you are maybe seeing that in the fields that you're in. Education is facing that same thing, whether it's for teachers, for food service staff, building and grounds people, administrators. In past years, if we go back a significant number of years, there were a lot of people looking for work in those different fields, and it was easier to attract and retain people. There's much more competition now, and not only with other public schools, but with private business. We're competing with private business, especially for non-teaching positions. And one of the things that we're seeing because of that system that the state has in place, if you think back to that first chart on the side that says understanding the need for a referendum, that history of the state, what that has really created is a system of haves and have-nots. School districts have a wide variety of revenue compared to other school districts. And you saw earlier in the comparisons, we're already on the low end. Not only are we already on the low end, but a number of other school districts in our area and in our conference are bringing to their voters additional operating referendums and in many cases having those passed, so that school districts around our area, around the state, that are able to bring in additional operating referendum from their taxpayers, have the resources to be able to offer a wide variety of programs, academic programs, extracurricular opportunities for students, small or reasonable class sizes, compete for staff members. Whereas school districts that have lower revenues, it's much more difficult not only to offer those programs, but to attract and retain staff members across all of our employee groups. So this represents the details of the referendum. And on the title, it talks about the total tax levy authority projection. So this is the total amount that the school board has the authority to levy each year if the referendum passes. And that word authority is important because each year the board makes a decision on how much of that amount they want to ask the taxpayers for in that year. So I want to walk through this because this explains what impact on the levy the referendum would have. So 22-23 is our current school year. You can see that the green represents the $2.5 million operating referendum that's in place right now. I shared earlier that it's in place this year plus 3 more years. So you can see the green bar, and then it expires. So out in 26-27, that $2.5 million drops off of the levy or expires. The orange represents the additional $9.5 million in operating funds that would come in place over the course of the next 4 years. It would be $4 million in the first year, then an additional $1 million each of the next 2 years, and then $3.5 million in that 4th year. And the yellow $3 million is currently in this year's levy. This year's levy is just a shade under $22 million. So you can see from the table, it doesn't say exactly here, but it's about a shade under $22 million. $3 million of that is a one-time debt prepayment or a debt defeasance. What the board, the decision that the board made back in November when they set the levy, as they do every year, was to prepay $3 million in debt payments because by doing that, it not only knocks off that $3 million from our total debt, it saved future interest payments of about $1.4 million. So it was a long-term decision by the board to save the school district some future payments. And that was a 1-year decision by the board. When that expires for the coming year off the levy, and the referendum question is an additional $4 million, the $3 million goes away, $4 million is added on to the levy, so the net increase on the levy would be $1 million from the referendum. So remember I said this was a shade under $22 million. The levy impact, or the referendum impact on that would be $1 million increase in the first year. You can see $1 million increase in the second year is pretty straightforward. In 25-26, another $1 million on the levy. And then in that 4th year, when the $2.5 million expires, it would be $3.5 million that would take its place. So $2.5 million expires, $3.5 million takes its place, which would give the board the authority to levy up to that amount, but it would have $1 million net impact on the levy each of those 4 years. One last thing before I slip to the next slide, because it's a common question that we've gotten, is what happens beyond 26-27. This referendum is asking for those 4 years of increases. So from this referendum, what would happen is that bar for 26-27 would remain at that level moving forward from this referendum. Another common question we get is, what will that do to the mill rate? And the mill rate is the district level rate per $1,000 of fair market property value. So in the example that I used earlier for this year, our total tax levy which this year's a shade under $22 million. That's divided by the total equalized property value across our entire district. That includes all of the residents in the district, the property value, the equalized property value of the homes in the district, the businesses in the district, the ag land in the district. So our levy is spread out amongst all of those property tax payers. What this shows in the table and in the graph on the right is our mill rate history, and it's the blue on the right in the graph, and then our projected mill rate if the referendum is to pass, and that's the red in the graph on the right. So if we start with our mill rate history, you can see in the graph there's some ups and downs in the blue, but overall it's stayed relatively steady. There are some districts that go up over $12 for their mill rate. At times they'll drop down below $7. Our school board has done a great job over the years of trying to keep that relatively steady. And when it does increase, when there's something that they ask the taxpayers for, then over the next few years it decreases over time. And you can see that both in the numbers here, where the high was $9.26 in 2019. The low over this period of time was $7.81. And all the other years have been between those two, between that maximum and minimum. And the average over the past 10 years is $8.61. So that's been our average mill rate. It compares very favorably to other school districts around our area. And we really emphasize that this is our district-wide mill rate. Right now, this year is $8.11. So as a whole, if you take our total levy divided by our equalized property value times 1,000, you get that $8.11. That for some people though, depending on what municipality you live in, it might be different in the city of Janesville versus the township of Fulton, for example. Because property values will go up and down in each of those municipalities, and each individual's property value may increase. So it's based on what an individual's fair market property value would be, but for the district as a whole, for $100,000 in property value, the annual property tax for the school district would be $811 per year for every $100,000 of property value across the district. When we did our projections, we used the revenue projections that we looked at earlier, where that levy increases both by what we anticipate an increase of $125 per pupil from the state. So if the state does less than that or more than that, that would impact these numbers. And built into these numbers is for the projections is if the referendum were to pass. The one other thing that's built into these projections for our total equalized property value, we projected a 4.7% increase each year in the property values across the district. And that's from existing properties increasing in value, and it's also from new properties being built. If a new home is built, if a new business opens. And we came up with that 4.7% by looking at the average increase over the past 10 years. Now this past year, the year that just ended, our property values across our district increased by over 17%. And that increase was very much an outlier, so when we computed that average, we threw that 17% out and looked at the 10 years prior to that. If we used that 17% into the average, then our projection would have been more than 4.7, and these projected mill rates would be lower, but we don't want to assume that that outlier is going to be baked in upcoming years. So the 4.7% increase has been our 10-year average across our district. And again, that's from new businesses opening up, new homes being built, new homes being built, or increased value in properties that already exist. So then in the red builds in that $1 million net increase in the levy. So for 23, the projected mill rate would go up from $8.11 to $8.21. So again, $8.11 means $811 per year on $100,000 of property value. $8.21 means $821 per year in for every $100,000 of property value. So it would be an additional $10 per year for every $100,000 of property value across the district. In the future years, it would go up to $828 and $831. In that fourth year, up to $837. And then when those $1 million increases on the levy are gone, it would go down to $8.21. And that kind of mirrors our past history of when the board asks for additional revenue, it goes up above that average, but then as time goes on, it goes down. One of the things that was important to the board as they were making their considerations was looking for steady increases in the levy to provide those additional operating funds, and they built that in with that $1 million each year, rather than asking for a lot one year and not as much the next, and having more of a roller coaster for the taxpayers. And then also keeping the projected mill rate within our historical range, and with what's being proposed, it would stay below that 10-year average of our mill rates. The last slide with any information is what will be on the ballot. So it's the School District of Milton. We're in Rock and Jefferson counties. It's asking the voters to authorize the district to exceed the revenue limit by $4 million for 23-24, by an additional $1 million, or a total of $5 million for 24-25, an additional $1 million for 25-26, which would put that total at $6 million, and then an additional $3.5 million for 26-27 is where that total of $9.5 million comes from. And it would remain at that amount for recurring purposes consisting of ongoing educational programming, staffing, and maintenance expenses. So our district has a history of some non-recurring referendums in the past. I spoke a little bit earlier to that. This is a recurring referendum, and one consideration that the school board had as they were looking at that is a non-recurring referendum works great for short-term or one-time needs, but if you're anticipating ongoing needs for your programs, for your staff, to care for your buildings so that you don't stack up deferred maintenance expenses over time, there needs to be consistent, predictable operating revenue. So that was the last thing that I wanted to share. There's information on our website that has a lot of this information and also some frequently asked questions. So we would encourage you to go there if you have questions. But we want to take the rest of the time tonight to answer any questions that folks have, engage in conversation about the information that was provided, or any other information that you have. So I think Jeremy's going to hit the front lights. So are there questions or thoughts that people have? Yep.
Yeah, Rich, I have a couple of quick, easy questions. Your slide with the total tax levy authority projection, the same one that's on here, this bar graph.
Yep.
Can you go back to that?
Yeah. That one?
Yeah. What is that area in blue?
The area in blue is the rest of the levy. So in general, that's available operating funds, but this is this amount that just a shade under 22 million is the total that our district's taxpayers are funding this year. And on that other slide, it showed that our funding, a portion of our funding comes from the state, a portion from local taxpayers, and then a small amount from the federal government. So this whole thing is the level that the board can approve for the levy. So this is what we would have available. It's 17 million or so, 16.5 million, without that 3 million and without that additional 2.5 million.
So are you saying that 17 million in the blue in the first bar, that's local, state, and federal dollars?
No, that is just local. This whole bar
That's
is just local.
I'm asking specifically about the blue area though.
The blue area is the portion of the local that doesn't include the 2.5 million non-recurring referendum and doesn't include the $3 million debt defeasance. So one of the things that you'll see then as you go from year to year, if this referendum passes, that blue part stays the same, but the orange gets added to the blue because it's additional operating funds. So if this year, when moving to here, it would be the blue that we had plus the 4 million and the 2.5 million stays. And then the blue would grow by 1 million here, and then it would grow by 1 million plus the 3.5, but the total levy would increase by 1 million. So it's really, it's increasing our overall operating funds as a district to address that shortfall that we have in that other graph, and providing us with, over time, that $9.5 million in additional operating funds. And our business manager, Carrie Bradley, is here, and she might be able to add some things to that. Or Carrie, is there anything that you want to add to the description of the
The blue box, yeah, and we actually had some conversations about what do we label the blue box. So, this is the total levy, okay, which the board levies for multiple purposes. The board levies for general operations, and that's controlled by the revenue limit.
Yep.
The board also levies for debt service.
Yep.
And a piece of the debt service is the yellow box on there,
Mhm.
but there's also more in the blue box that's part of debt service. And then the board also levies for the community service fund. And so we had talked about the changes, but also thought that we need to put those changes into context of the total levy. I think I'm describing our conversations accurately. And so that's why you have the blue boxes, so that you can see the whole picture.
Mhm.
But those are the different components that are in the blue box, and in Fund 10, the green box would also be part of Fund 10, or our general
Fund 10?
operations, which is
That's
the
general
revenue
operations.
limit.
Yeah.
So, does
Fund
that help?
10 is when Carrie describes
Yeah,
Fund
I'm
10
sorry.
of general operations, that's the money that we use to run our day-to-day expenses for general education, for extracurricular programs. It doesn't include, like, food service has a separate fund, special education has a separate fund, but Fund 10 is in general our operating revenue.
Thank you.
if will. And you said you had another question?
I'll do one more quick one, and then I'll let other people ask, but it wasn't in your presentation, which is fine, but I've been just tracking, your staff FTEs year over year. Do you know, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, make Carrie know it, but what are your staff FTEs for this year?
When you talk about staff, is it like
It's
all employees,
Yeah,
full-time and part-time?
yeah, so,
Okay.
for an example, just to give you a marker here, make sure, it's somewhere, well, it's your total of your licensed, your support staff, your operating, your administrative, so I guess it would be all of them.
Okay, and I don't have that exact number, I mean, I could get it to you, or we could build it into this, or build it into a frequently asked question.
Okay.
One of the things, one important piece of that is, that I can answer, is what portion of our overall expenses are spent on staff. School district, us and every other school district are very much people-oriented for our expenses. And for our school district, a little bit over 75% of our total expenses every year are for people, and people meaning all of our different employees. And that includes salaries, benefits, and that's not just for teachers and administrators and food service staff, that also includes substitute teachers, things like that. So a little bit over 75%. So that's why when I talk about if we need to make significant reductions in our overall budget, we can't do it without reducing the number of people that we have.
Yeah.
Carrie, do you have a general number of
Not total staff.
staff?
No, I don't want to ballpark it. I mean,
If I send one of you an email, could you,
Yeah,
send me
as a
an email.
reminder? Okay, I will,
Something we can find out really easily.
yeah.
We can answer the question, But one of the things, just to be mindful of, well, actually, there's two things. One of the things when it comes to staffing and monitoring that number of staff, annually we go through a process and we look at student enrollment and we work to align our staffing with our student enrollment. And then another thing to think about is that when you're educating children, they may have different needs and also put pressures up and down on that staffing piece too, when you're looking at year-over-year changes. So there's just a couple things.
This is
One we
really
already
good.
do. Oh,
Yeah,
you're there.
really good examples.
Okay.
I went back to this slide because I didn't talk through the points, but that's one of the points here, that one of the things that we put in place is an annual alignment of our staff to our student enrollment. So as our student enrollment changes, we look at, well, what adjustments can we make to our staffing? A great example of that for this coming year, whether the referendum passes or not, that's something that we do, because it makes sense if we have fewer students to look for ways that we can become more efficient with our staffing. It isn't always easy to do, because if we talk about teachers, for instance, if we have fewer students, that decrease doesn't always come in a classroom size at one of our schools. So what we do is we look at each of our 4 levels, our kindergarten through 3rd grade, our 4 through 6, our 7 and 8 at the middle school, and then 9 through 12 at the high school. And we look at what the enrollment projections are for each of those levels, and then we look at how many teachers we would need for those programs. And for this coming year, we're looking at reducing 2 teaching positions in kindergarten through 3rd grade, reducing 1 at 7th and 8th grade and 1 at 9th through 12th grade. So a total reducing 4 teaching positions. We always look for ways that we can be more efficient in our administration and running our school district. One of the recent changes that we made there was we moved away from a director of technology to a technology supervisor to be more hands-on and not have a layer at the top. It's more of a person that's in charge of that department, but rolls up their sleeves and is not at the director level. So we look for ways to do that. We've had in place for the last couple of years, as we prepared for this, anytime someone leaves the district, we have a conversation about, does that position need to be rehired, or is there a way we could make adjustments to either do without that position or make adjustments to reduce the need, because we've known that this has been coming. So it puts a little strain on our directors, supervisors, and principals to make those reductions, but that's something that we think is important as our enrollment changes. And it isn't a question you asked, but I'm going to take just a minute to talk a little bit about enrollment too. We, like other school districts across the state, there's a lot more 18-year-olds in the state of Wisconsin than there are 5-year-olds. And as you go from 18-year-olds down to 5-year-olds, it's a pretty steady progression of fewer and fewer every step down. That's a combination of people having smaller families, people waiting longer to start families, and it's not, I said not just us, but the state, and it's a national issue. So because of that, we graduate out those 18-year-olds. We graduated out 280, 290, 275 kids the last few years, and we've brought in smaller groups of kindergartners than we graduate out. We've brought in 230, 220 kindergartners, so there might be a 60 or 72 student swing, and that's the biggest impact from year to year on your enrollment, is how many kids graduate out versus how many new kindergartners come in. So we're seeing at times 50, 60, 70 student difference in those numbers, but our overall enrollment isn't going down by that much because of 2 things. We're having more families move into our district than move out, so we're gaining more students outside of that graduate kindergarten mix, and we're also having increases in our number of open enroll in versus our open enroll out. So at those grade levels between kindergarten and 12th grade, our enrollment is growing. It's offset very much that 50 to 60 student shift from graduates to kindergartners. Yes?
Hey, you're just saying about how there's an expected reduction in enrollment. And the last referendum to, upgrade and, make bigger facilities it was my understanding that we were expecting an increase in enrollment. And I'm wondering, how do those two work together?
Yeah, and I'm gonna speak to that. I'm gonna see if I can, because someone else had that question, so I'm gonna take just a second here to see if I can pull that slide up that was shared at the last board meeting. And my apologies here real quick while I do that, or try to do that. Yeah, and the numbers in the grid might be kind of small, but I'll kind of walk through. This just went to our board at the last board meeting, and it went because at 2 times each year, in September and in January, school districts across the state are required to do a student count. And so you can see, you maybe see across the top for the past 10 years, it has January and September and January student counts. It has those total pupil counts from kindergarten through 12th grade here in the table. But what I want to refer you to is the graph, because that kind of shows going back to the 12-13 year, and it's hard to read on here, but this is the 2012-2013. This is the current year, and this has been our enrollment over time. So over that period of time of about 10 years, and there's 20 different data points there because it points the September at the start of the year and then the January in the middle of the year. There was a slight decline over time, a pretty steady increase, and then kind of some ups and downs, and the last couple years have been relatively steady. So when I talk about graduating out 50 or 60 more, but that being offset by new families moving in, you can see in these numbers here over the last few years, if we go back to, I don't remember exactly what year that referendum was passed, but if you go back even like 5 or 6 years, the 34-37, right now, this past January, we're in the 3,300s through 2015, and then we've been in the 3,400s since then. It's gone up and down a little bit in the 3,400s, but this is pretty stable. I would describe this as stable, and if we go all the way back and compare this, maybe slight increases. So we've been able to offset that by offering programs and educational opportunities that people value. Families move into our community because of the quality of our schools. We have students open enrolling in because of the quality of our schools. When that last referendum was passed, and this might be something if board members, well, I don't know if any of the board members who are here might not have been on the board at the time either. Although I see Joe here. Joe, you can maybe speak to this a little bit. But I'll share one thing first, is that a huge part of the need for the referendum was how overcrowded the space was at both the middle school and the high school. And I see Principal Bill Horn nodding his head strongly in agreement. It was both to add additional space, to modernize our learning areas, and to replace some different things that didn't have a future expected life. I'm thinking of our old swimming pool as an example. We had to do something with the swimming pool. The other thing that it did, that the referendum did at our elementary schools, that's been incredibly valuable, is it's allowed us to bring our 4K classrooms into our elementary schools. So we have 2 sections of 4K at Milton East, Milton West, and at Harmony. We previously had been renting space for those 4K students. So that was one of the things on the list of ways we become more efficient, is bringing those. It's not only best for students, for 4K students, to be in the schools where they're going to be as kindergartners, and one less transition for the students and families, but it also saves us that annual rent money. So Dave Holterman was going to add something to that?
Yeah, I'll give an example of kind of pre and post capital referendum. I graduated here in the 1990s in the middle school. Prior to the referendum, this recent capital referendum passing was essentially unchanged. And so my graduating class was probably about 150 in the middle school that existed as it was prior to 2021 when the addition was done. And so, how much space there was for 150 students in a grade versus 230, 240 that's there now. The improvements, in my mind, were delayed too long there should have been some additional space in that building, for example, sooner, because it wasn't, it was designed to have 300 or 350 children in it, and don't quote me on those numbers, but essentially, the class sizes had grown dramatically from the time that I went there to the time that the addition was done, and essentially was unchanged for that 20 years from when I was there to 25 years to present. So, I would argue part of that was just simply catching up. And I don't know if any of the other building staff wanted to piggyback on that, but from my observation, was really a game of catch up more so than anything else at that point.
Joe, did you have anything else that you wanted to share from the board? Because Joe was on the board at that time.
Yeah, no, I think you've captured it in pretty succinct terms there. I mean, my look back goes back to 2004 and 2005, and starting to look at facilities, and we were in a period of some rapid growth then that changed for a number of factors, of course. So it's hard to react quick enough from a capital building project, if you will. You know, when we studied the data, at that point, we were growing about 100 students a year, and tried to put together a plan so we could accommodate that. Obviously, when 208 happened, things sort of stalled, if you will. We didn't do anything or pursue any kind of a capital project, but our numbers, rather than continue to grow, some folks forecasted sharp declines based on General Motors in Janesville and the general economy. And when that didn't happen and we basically flattened out, part of what was driving, and Rich alluded to this, we were significantly overcrowded in several of our facilities. And that was coupled with being obsolete in some form or fashion in some of those buildings. So the capital referendum was intended to address both of those issues a little bit. And obviously we did, acquire the additional space that has proven incredibly valuable, and we're also able to address the obsolescence or outdatedness of several pieces of both this building and the other buildings that we were able to renovate. So
It's a really good question, and it's an important part of the conversation. About half of that $59.9 million capital referendum was for projects here at the high school. And I saw, Jeremy, you had kind of raised your hand like you wanted to share something.
No, they shared that too. There was a lot of catching up, and the crowd was addressing that. It's a good question. We knew we had flat enrollment, but it's really catching up and fixing the thing.
Rick?
The capital referendum also addressed some safety and accessibility issues that had been problems for a long time. All the buildings now have the secure entrances. At Milton East, we used to have kids in the basement, and so there were accessibility issues there. So things like that were addressed too.
One of the things that happens, and I won't go back up on the slides, so I'll have to toggle back, but on that revenue and expenditures chart that you have in front of you, when you have shortfalls like that and you need to make budget adjustments, and some folks here saw me doing, you see the revenues and expenditures here on the graph is much easier than what I used to do with my hands. It was the flat revenues and expenses going up, and you have a shortfall. And you've got to either raise revenue or decrease expenses. If you have that shortfall and you have to make adjustments, one of the things that is considered is delaying the fixing of roofs and repairing parking lots and things like that. And when you do that, you're really kicking the can down the road. Those needs don't go away, and those needs become more expensive the longer you kick them down the road. And that was part of the past operating referendum too, was addressing needs that had built up over time. The one other thing on that I want to point out, because it ties in really well to that mill rate chart, is if you look at that chart right in the middle, from 2018 to 2019 is when that $59.9 million operating referendum was passed. The mill rate increased, I think, to the high of $9.26, if I'm remembering right from that other table. But then you can see over time, over a couple of years, that mill rate, that tax burden on the taxpayers, went down a little bit the first year, then it went down pretty significantly the next year, because those property values rose, so that amount is getting spread out among more and more people. We are seeing pretty good housing growth right now in our district after a stall across everywhere for a while during COVID especially. And those new houses will spread that tax base out more as new businesses join. Or there's a pretty significant in the city of Milton, TID district that's gonna be coming onto the tax base here in the next couple of years that will spread that tax base out even more. So those things, things like that also have an impact. Did that get at the gist of your question? Other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, could you go back to the graph where you're comparing the Badger schools?
Yep, give me just a minute. This one?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, when you compare Milton to some of these other schools, these districts are a lot larger than ours. And I noticed that when you look at the Fed on Milton, and you see some of the other ones are a lot larger than ours, why is that? Is that we're not requesting federal funds for the district?
Well, let's start with the second question that
Okay.
you asked. And he's referring to the yellow portion is the federal portion for each district. And you can see if you look at ours on the far end, that amount is pretty small. You can see the districts where it's, I mean, there's some others that are similar to that, but you can see Monroe is a little bit bigger. You can see Reedsburg and Watertown in there. And another place where it's maybe even more clear is if I go to the Rock County districts, you can again see that our federal is pretty small. Janesville and Beloit especially are larger. And I'm gonna ask Carrie to speak a little bit to that because she's the finance guru of our team. Guru.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the federal funds, those are done with a formula that uses to calculate the amount that you get. Most of them are entitlement programs, meaning that we don't have to pursue the grants are provided to us.
Okay.
And when they do the calculation, depending upon which one it is, there's a grant related to special education, and that looks at the number of students that we have, students with disabilities requiring special education, but it also looks at your socioeconomic status of the students that you have. So it looks at, and so districts where you see more federal money typically means that they have more students, I'm gonna use the shortened version, that qualify for free and reduced lunch. That's often used as a measure. Okay, so the Fed then works to backfill for districts whose children don't have the same resources from district to district based on their family income. So it's not so much about applying for them, it's really about the formula. And this is 2021 data. So this is happening before the ESSER money comes through.
COVID relief
The
funds.
COVID relief funds. Okay, so as we look at this data moving forward, I think that federal piece is gonna be varying. That money was been made available for multiple years and so forth. But this slide, I think, is primarily talking about the formula entitlement grants.
Do you remember, Carrie, approximately what portion of our overall funding is from the federal government? I mean, we can see from the height of the bar and the size of the yellow that it's a pretty small portion. And that a large majority for every district is made up either is made up from both state and local property taxes.
I couldn't tell you, but if you would actually go to can I talk about the state piece of the pie?
Go ahead.
Rich? If you go to the slide, well, you can look at Rock County, but you can really see it when you go to
The Badger?
the Badger.
Okay, one other quick thing on
Sure.
Rock County, because the other question you mentioned that a number of those districts are bigger than us.
Correct.
And it's even more pronounced in Rock County. In Rock County, we've got Janesville and Beloit are the bigger school districts. We're kind of in the middle, and the other districts are smaller than
Yeah,
us.
'cause Clinton, I know, is smaller.
Yep, Parkview is pretty small.
Yes, there is.
If we go back to this one, these districts are much more close to each other in size. And Jeremy, you might know
Yeah,
this best, but we're kind of in the middle.
We're actually in the Badger large. I know some of those cities actually might be larger, but you take a look at the total size of of school districts, we're actually in the larger half of the Badger Conference,
Based on enrollment?
based on enrollment.
And I think one other thing that's worth clarifying regarding this particular graph is this is per member.
Yes.
So even if it was the city of Madison versus us, it's still, and clearly it's not up there, but it's a per member comparison. So if you have 5,000 students or 1,000 students, or 2,500 students, it's equalized in that it's per member rather than per district. So that gives an apples to apples comparison of each respective district.
So when Jeremy said that we're in the Badger Large, these schools for athletic purposes are split into a large half and a small half. So we're in the bigger half, enrollment wise. And Carrie, you were gonna share something on this slide.
Yeah, if I can, it's an opportunity for me to talk about the school funding formula. If you will bear with me, I'll try and keep it short, okay? This is total revenue, okay? And a piece of that is revenue that's controlled by the revenue limit. Revenue limit is our operational funds, and those are a combination of taxpayer dollars and general state aids, okay? So, if you look at Milton, you can see that, we have a larger green bar section compared to, let's go with Winona Grove.
Yeah.
That's the tax bill I pay. So part of it is based on the property value that we have, that equalized property value per member. And the goal of the formula, just like the federal funds are trying to kind of provide additional resources, the goal of that equalization aid is to make sure that we all have the same tax base, so property tax base to support each member. So I probably went too far, and I'll step back, but everybody can learn this, you just gotta hang in there with me, and if you have any questions, let me know. But one of the things about our district is that we are about 2/3 funded with state aid when it comes to our general operational fund. And other districts get more, like Beloit had more, and Winona Grove has less. But that's a way that the state tries to provide, tax base behind each student. And then when you get to the amount of revenue that you're, allowed, that's related to that calculation then, and getting the authority then to levy the funds.
And I think in general, the percent that's state funded and compared to the percent that's local funded isn't something that we have control over. That's all tied to the different formulas that the state has for funding its school district.
But you did say the state funding is starting to go down, right?
The level of state funding hasn't kept up with inflation, and that's going back to so the far right where there's no increase, that's when the revenue limit has been frozen. And if the revenue limit has been frozen, that's when we talk about flat revenues over time, or slightly increasing, might be slightly increasing, might be slightly decreasing, depending on what your enrollment is doing. But inflationary costs are going like this, and money coming in is staying level.
And what is the response from the government then to you folks about that issue?
I love that question. I really do.
I mean,
Because
I would
that's,
think you'd have Steve Knox sitting here.
that's a really important question. And especially as the state is sitting on a pretty significant fund balance right now. And in this legislative session, they're gonna have conversations about what to do with the fund balance, and there's all kinds of different things that could be done with it. But we know that there's a history of underfunding schools and shifting that burden from the state to local taxpayers. So I don't get to decide that, but if I did, we'd go back to a system where there's regular increases, a more uniform system, so that it doesn't depend on what school district you live in. That every school district in the state, in my mind, should be funded in a manner that there's not huge discrepancies between what opportunities are available for kids from one school district to another. It shouldn't be based on a family's area code, the type of services that their schools are able to provide, whether it's having a large number of kids in a first grade classroom or a lot of academic opportunities, AP classes for students, and band, music programs and things like that. And I think, and again, I'm moving off the facts into opinion, but I think that we've done a really good job over the years of balancing, providing a high quality education and opportunities for students at a price that, compared to neighboring districts, has been reasonable to our taxpayers. And I don't want people to interpret that as me saying that the amount that people pay in taxes is too low or isn't important. I think it's very important. And we work really hard to keep both of those things at the forefront. How can we operate efficiently, but also continue to provide high quality programs for our students?
But I think you need to address more with our state legislatures, because the burden's falling on the parents and the community who, we're not getting pay raises, we're not getting extra money, but our taxes keep going up. And what, our house has been assessed like 3 times in the last 6 years.
Yep.
And it's gone up, and now we pay for a referendum, and now we're gonna be hit with possibly another referendum. I think we may lose people in this community from that fact. And, I personally know Steve Nass, he worked with me, I was in the military with him. I've made this point to him, and I can't get a straight answer, but the state is really playing games right now, and I don't like it.
I don't think it's just that individual that you're talking
No,
about.
it's not Steve,
But
but
it-
he has good influence in this area.
But it can be difficult sometimes to get a straight answer from politicians.
Oh, yeah,
I would
I know.
totally agree with that. And when we talk about and that's that balance, and that's why it was important to the board to keep this at a level that matches where we've been as a district. And we don't have a slide that shows the mill rates at neighboring schools, but you can look it up. And we compare really favorably. So if someone comes in and says, I'm gonna move to Clinton because your taxes are too high, I can tell you right now, Clinton's mill rate is up here in the 12-ish range. And if we look at all of Rock County, we have a very reasonable, compared to other Rock County districts, mill rate. But I also know that families and individuals are facing the same inflationary costs that we are as a school district. It creates a burden on folks. The one thing I went to this slide because I think this plays a part, and I don't think I've talked about it before, or maybe I alluded to it, but this is the levy authority. And it's based on a $125 increase per year from the state. If the state comes through with less than that, then this money is gonna still result in some shortfalls, and we're gonna have to make some reductions, even though they wouldn't be as large as if it doesn't pass. If the state comes through with more than that, it isn't gonna happen that the state is gonna fill that gap, that the state is gonna provide enough that we won't have those projected shortfalls. But if the state comes through with some of that, then the board has the authority every year to look at how much is the state providing, and do we need to levy that entire amount, or can we levy less this year? And one of the things that they've done is and this was important in all the conversations at the board table, looking for ways to keep that mill rate fairly steady. If you recall on the one slide, we had the 17% property value increase in our district, so people got hit with their property taxes this year if you got assessed this year and your property went up. And if you're in a municipality that does it frequently, and from what I've heard, some municipalities do it fairly frequently, others not as often. If they don't do it as often, you're gonna get a big shocker, but it's not as often. But one of the things that's happened is, and was important to the board, is trying to keep that as level as possible so that for the school's portion of property taxes, people have an idea from one year to the next, what that's gonna look like. David?
Rich, could you go back to the slide that talks about the 92 districts that went to referendum here last November?
Yeah.
I think just for the benefit of kind of context, there's about 420 school districts in the state. So in round numbers, that's somewhere between 20 and 25% of the school districts in the state went to an operating referendum last November. An additional 52 coming up this April. And so The gentleman in front's comment about, what is the state doing with this, it's an excellent question. I mean, we're generally a low revenue district per member as it is now, and you look at the numbers across the state really has neglected this, and it's not being manifested solely here in Milton, but across the state. We've got, again, almost 25% went to referendum last November, and another, 10, 12% probably again, and so, until the state changes how it funds schools, this unfortunately is the new normal. And to your comment, Rich, about the haves and have-nots, it's unfortunate that, every district across the state is having to decide, how do we support education in a model that is not how we've done it historically in the state. And so, as we talked about it as a board, and I'm only commenting for myself here, but the comment is, when, for example, when my family moved here, we came out of the area in the 1980s, and my dad accepted a job in another community here in Rock County, and we chose to move to Milton. And the reason we chose to move here was that the schools were good schools, and I'm grateful and fortunate that I went to school here, and here we are faced with an issue created in Madison that we're trying to digest and make reasonable choices for now, and we want to continue to be that district of choice. And the choices we're making aren't easy, but they're the best choices in light of the situation, in light of the cards we've been dealt, if you will. And so, excellent questions up front, and again, this is our most conservative attempt to address the hand we've been dealt and try to make good choices from it.
Thank you. Did you have a question?
I just had a question on the total tax levy authority projection.
Mhm.
You mentioned that if this goes through, then that level that is shown in that slide will go on in perpetuity, is that right?
Yeah, it would.
So we'd look at those kind of levels on in the next years beyond that.
Yeah, it's here now. The
Mhm.
levy would go up, from the referendum, would go up $1 million each year. When it got to this level, the $2.5 million is gone, the $3 million is gone, but those are baked in then to our operating funds.
Mhm.
And then the referendum wouldn't have any impact on, this referendum wouldn't have any impact on future levies, so it would level off at that amount. Whereas in a non-recurring referendum like the green, you've got it for a period of years and then it goes away. The way we refer to this one is that it builds your base revenues, and that's what we use to operate our schools. And that's what's eroded over years because of the funding mechanism that the state has had. That base revenue is eroded. Yes.
So, there's 100 things swirling in my mind about this, but as I look at all of the comments that have been made in this gentleman over here, I don't know your name, but I could resonate with that, about, when does this stop? How do we, I'm thinking, okay, we're presented with the $59 million, this is gonna take care of things, then all of a sudden, COVID happens, all of that. But all I see is just ongoing, questions about passing it down to the local taxpayers. I know I'm not the only one who's, feeling that pinch. We don't even have children, so we feel even more of a pinch. And I'm just wondering, I don't feel too confident that it's not going to continue. And I agree with you, we're gonna lose people, we already are. I think I've seen a lot of houses for sale that probably wouldn't have been before because people are going to be priced out of the area. So I'm just curious about also what are other ways besides staffing reductions that can be looked at? I mean, I've worked in corporate, I've worked in government, and there's, so I'm familiar with how both ways look at it. And I just feel like in the age of transparency, it would be really nice if we could, this is a community problem, this isn't just a school, this is obviously a whole federal problem, but, I'm just wondering about that, because as I look and see all of the extracurricular activities that are just more and more are being added, I wonder where's education in all of that? That's just my view.
Yeah, I'll answer it. If there's more to it than I answer, go ahead and follow up with more questions. So, part of it ties back to the board's desire to keep that mill rate, which is the amount that people pay in their property taxes for the schools, to keep that as steady as possible. So although expenses rise for a school district, just like they do in a family budget, as those expenses rise, that's balanced by, that levy rising is balanced by more property to spread that out. And if those things are in alignment, then that mill rate stays steady. And that's been the goal of the board. And so where does it end? Ideally, we go back to a system like the state used to have, where school districts across the state would get enough to get by. The question that you had about where would those reductions come from? And we have a slide where we talked about efficiencies that we've looked at before, and I don't think I'm going in the right direction. Yeah, I was going in the right direction, sorry. Yeah, this one. So we've looked for ways to be efficient. I think our principals would agree that I've pushed them to look for ways in their schools and in their departments to look for efficiencies over the last few years. So we don't have a district, because we're a low revenue district, we don't have a lot of low hanging fruit, of what I would consider to be low hanging fruit. If we need to balance our budget by making millions of dollars in cuts each year for the next few years, we will have to have fewer people. And I want to speak a little bit about what fewer people means. Fewer people in all of our different employee groups means slower response time, means longer bus rides for students. It means longer waiting in line for your lunch and squeezing in, that type of thing. But the biggest impact that it has on students are reductions in the classroom. Fewer teachers and fewer aides means less support for students that struggle, and it means bigger class sizes, and bigger class sizes means that the teacher isn't able to provide the individual support that a smaller class size allows. It also means when you squeeze more students into a classroom, there's more behavior problems, because there's more students in that space, there's fewer adults to deal with those problems. So all of those are different pieces, and you spoke specifically to athletics and fine arts opportunities. Our extracurricular opportunities for students are an important part of what we do. We're very proud of our marching band and our show choir here at the high school. We're very proud of our different athletic teams, and we think that's an important part of education. It clearly is not the most important part, and that isn't where our focus is. We're incredibly proud of how strongly our students perform academically, and I think we've done a great job of balancing those opportunities and that high quality performance from students with being as efficient as we can. But we're at a point where the things that we've done have fit within our budget, but those years of frozen revenue limits and some increase in costs, and we think that 3% increase with our current inflation is being pretty reasonable, have reached a point where we won't be able to continue to provide the opportunities or the academics that we have in the past. And I don't know, principals, are there things that you want to add to that?
I will mention this to you, and I'm Jeremy Biller, I'm the high school principal. I meet with, dozens of families that are shopping high schools each year, and they want to know what programs that we have. And so when you think about, and people with an era of open enrollment, they do shop their schools with what the opportunities that they have. And so when you think about, and as students choose to go to other schools, that's lost state revenue as well too. So it's a balancing act. But I do meet with dozens of families every year. They want to know if we're going to go to Craig, or we're going to go to Milton, or our other schools. And so we do have to, and we're proud of what we've been able to do with And there, I would attest, there is not low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of changes that we've had to make, and still being able to offer, I think, is a good options for students that are competitive. But that is part of the challenge, and I would say the extracurricular activities, that's part of how people respond if they don't have the activities that they want.
One of the things that keeps our mill rate at a fairly steady level and strongly compares to our neighboring districts and other districts around our part of the state is that our community is very appealing for not only for families but for businesses. Having a strong school district brings businesses into your community, and that grows your total equalized value. That spreads that $22 million levy out among more folks because businesses want to locate where their employees are there, and their employees' kids are going to get a high quality education. And so having a strong school isn't just valuable for our students and isn't just valuable for the parents of our students. Having a strong school system and bringing out graduates every year that continue to live in our community, take jobs in our community, are a strong resource for our area.
So should the referendum not pass?
Let me pause you just for a second.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just gonna pause you. I'll stay and we'll stay to answer questions as long as people want, but we're not offended if you need to go too. So I don't want people sitting here thinking, yeah, I need to get home, but I don't wanna get up and it would be rude to get up. So feel free that when you need to go ahead. And I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I was just asking, so if, like, let's say the referendum doesn't pass, do you have some examples of what will be cut?
I'd be really hesitant to point to something and say, this is gonna go. I think I gave that presentation, I did this presentation for staff so that they were alert to the issue. And they asked that same question because they wanna know, obviously. And they said, well, would you say this librarian's position won't be here anymore, or X number of teaching positions would be gone? If it doesn't pass, we'd have to make a decision on what those reductions would be. And they'd be difficult decisions, they'd have to be pretty rapidly made decisions, but what specifically would be gone for next year isn't something that's been.
You don't wanna show your hand on that.
That's been determined, yeah.
People are, yeah, I understand.
But to be fair, and to follow up on that, how do you motivate people motivated to contact their legislator and say, these positions are gonna be cut, these programs are gonna be cut? What are you doing? What are you doing to help us out?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I was gonna say we, and by we I mean our board members and myself, talk to area legislators and explain this position with them. I've met with a couple of our area legislators over this past month, and some of them see that, and some of them don't. And the legislature has created the system that we have in place right now. And we know that Governor Evers and the legislature don't see eye to eye on the level to fund schools at the state level. Legislators have said flat out that they prefer a system where local decisions are made. And that isn't every legislator, but it's important to let them know what impact that system has. And the biggest thing for me is that it creates that haves and have-nots. Districts that can afford to operate the way they have been, and districts that have to make significant reductions. And I don't think I shared this yet, but one conversation that the board had on that topic was around, do we want to ask for enough money to enhance the programs that we have, to add more opportunities for students, to decrease our class sizes, or do we want to ask for enough to keep in place what we have now? And the decision that they came to was to look for ways to keep what we have in place right now. So this isn't to look for ways to compete with the highest spending districts or to become one of the highest revenue school districts, because this wouldn't do that for us. This really is put in place to allow us to maintain the things that we're doing now and do it at a cost to the taxpayers that, if you recall that mill rate slide, at a cost to the taxpayers that stays relatively steady over time.
I'd like to answer her question though. She said, when does it end? I'm gonna tell you when it's gonna end. In my mind, if the state doesn't come through and the burden becomes the taxpayers, schools are gonna go to privatize. And that's gonna be the end. Because the state, your local state taxpayers can actually flip in the bill.
That's one of the reasons that we led with this slide, because local public schools are the lifeblood of many communities. There are some communities that have private school options. There are some legislatures that would prefer that public schools become more popular, that private schools grow. But that just extenuates the haves and have-nots, because we pay, I mean, we take out of our funds money to pay for private school tuition for students that live within our school district. So if that program grows and tuition stipends are continue to be paid for that, which is something the legislature is going to consider growing, that takes away from our bucket of money and gives us less to spend on our local students, which is also something that if I was in charge of that system, it wouldn't be what I would prefer.
I've heard a few legislators talking about privatizing schools, and if the flow keeps going, it may end up that way because they can't agree.
I think that's a really important point. And I would encourage folks to reach out to your area legislators. In March, I think March 23rd, they have the State School Board Association has a legislative day where school board members from across the state go and meet with legislators and share the impact that this has. And it's a popular topic across the state. School districts across the state either had this conversation last year, you saw the numbers from last year, or are having this conversation now or over the next year or two. Every school district in the state is feeling the pinch.
So, from a taxpayer's perspective, I don't have any children in the school system.
My number one goal is to make sure that the children are educated. It's important for our society, right? And then from a taxpayer's perspective, I just wanna make sure that the extra money that I keep putting in the kitty each year is improving performance. So that's point number one. Point number two, everybody has bias. I come from the private sector. Put my cards on the table. And so in the private sector, when we, like if I would go to the board of directors or senior leadership, I would be asked, okay, Dan, you want this money, but what am I gonna get in return? And so what concerns me, just to be honest, frank, is that I've seen, and I've looked at the DPI numbers, and the expenses have increased, roughly 5% per year over the past 5 years, a total of about 27%. It's from the DPI numbers, okay, for Milton. Okay, let me go with the premise here. So it's increased significantly, but then I juxtapose it to the performance, and I'll probably get eye rolls on this too, but we don't have much to go on. We have DPI scorecards, okay, and I know they're not perfect, but somehow you gotta pick a horse and you gotta run with it. And so when I look over that same time horizon, over the last 5 years, particularly, so, that kind of blanks out COVID. COVID falls into the mix. The performance of Milton School District has gone down. When I look at, particularly English language arts proficiencies, the accountability scores, which I know is, a little magic goes into those numbers. When I look at the overall rating going from, exceeding expectations to meeting expectations, it's taken a step backwards. So that concerns me. So then when I look at your bar graph where you have either the Badger community or the other schools across Rock County, and just go to the Rock County one if you could, Rich. This one, the correlation between
the spend per member, or the spend per student, to performance isn't strong. I mean, I've even done analysis on that, it's particularly in Rock County. So, and I know there's other variables, but for instance, you got Beloit there, it's around $17,000 a student, and they're the worst or second to the worst performing district in the state. But they get $17,000. I look Parkview and Edgerton, I think they both exceed expectations, have strong proficiency skills, but as you see, you know, they're below average as well. Okay, they're a little bit less below average in terms of the member spend than Milton. But my point is, there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between how much you spend per student and performance. And so when I look at all of the information that's put forward, what's largely left out of this conversation, conveniently, is performance. So as a taxpayer, or if I were a business person, I wanna give you more money, but, I know we have problems with state funding and so forth, but what do I get in return, or more importantly, what do the kids get in return in terms of performance? And I don't see that story message here, so maybe, we're not gonna solve that tonight, but maybe at the very least, for helping you sell a referendum like this, it would be helpful that we could understand that correlation a little bit better. Does that make sense?
It does, and I appreciate the question. I'll share a little bit on it.
Yeah.
I mean, to answer all of that, we might need to sit down for an hour or two,
right.
To get into
I know,
it.
I fully
But there's
understand that.
a couple quick points on it. One is, anytime you're comparing one district to another based on a score, one of the things that you need to take into account are the demographic differences in those school districts. We know that students that live in homes of poverty have a more difficult time being successful in school. And that's been proven for years and years that's.
But can I stop you on that? That's exactly what you're doing here.
What's that?
That's exactly what you're doing here. I mean, there's different.
This isn't a
So,
comparison to.
There's different socioeconomic variables in each one of those communities, even though it's Rock County, like particularly Beloit versus Milton per se.
Yeah, so when you compare.
But what you're doing is, you're saying just cost per member. And you're simplifying, what is something that's fairly complex, but it's not telling the story of what we get in return for that.
Yeah, this is very much specific to, the title of the graph. It's revenue per member. It does not get into at all.
Right.
What opportunities are available for students. But one of the things that we know, even though we have the lowest revenue per member in Rock County and in the Badger Conference, we know that we provide really strong opportunities for students and have strong student achievement. I have been ranked by Niche, who's in the business of ranking schools across the country, as the best, the #1 school district in Rock County. And I think you've shared before, there's all kinds of things that go into that ranking. There's all kinds of things that go into the state report card score. And we know very well that on the achievement portion of the state report card score and on the graduation, on track to graduation score, we score extremely high, as well as any of the other districts in Rock County. But we also know that there are some areas that we need to do better. That the main area that we need to get better on that brings those scores down is that target group outcome score, which they used to call achievement gap. It's that difference between the students that are achieving at a higher level and students that are achieving at a lower level. Our overall average achievement from all students compares incredibly well with any of these other districts. But we have a bigger gap, so one of the things that we're working on is how can we continue to show growth for the students who are doing well, because we want to continue to challenge them and continue their growth, but also provide support for students that are struggling so that they can catch up. And it's not catch up to be at the same level, because we know that there's always going to be a difference between students that are succeeding at the highest level and students who aren't, by definition. but things that we can do to narrow that gap, and we have some really good things in place, to narrow that gap, are gonna not only benefit all students, but also show up in that report card score.
But if you do, rate, rising tide lifts all boats, if you do raise the underperformers and even challenge the upper, bottom line is, you're gonna get a better score. So that manifests itself in better DPI scores, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think that you and I just said the same thing, but maybe I misunderstood what you just said.
Yeah, well, I don't wanna go too far down the rabbit hole, I guess, let's just, cause it is a deep subject, but, it's just, I look at the performance, and I know everybody's working hard, it's not meant to be derogatory to anyone, however, it comes down to performance. And when I look at the proficiencies and their rankings versus the other school districts, Milton's fallen off, and maybe that's partly why you're seeing a net negative transfer out.
We aren't
versus
seeing a net negative transfer out, we're seeing a net positive transfer in. I spoke to that earlier when I talked about.
At the same rate as it's been in the past?
50 to 60 student difference from graduating seniors to kindergartners means that we should lose 50 to 60 students every year, but we aren't. We're losing maybe 13 one year, 25 one year, but always less than this difference because we have a pretty significant net increase in students moving in, whether that's a change in our open enrollment numbers or, and a change in families moving to our community compared to families that are moving out. We have a fairly strong net increase in move-ins. And this is a, you can't even see the numbers here, so I apologize. This is in board docs though from our last board meeting, if you wanna look at it. The red and the green here are over the past few years, the change from our September count to our January count. So those are increases or decreases during the school year, and the red are decreases and the green are increases, and you can see 7 of the last 8 years, we've gained more students than we've lost between September and January. And during that same time frame, our number of our open enrollment gap, which we used to have, has narrowed every year since, I'm in my 4th year here, so I can't speak to prior to that, but I know what it was when I got here, and it was pretty significant. There's a lot of things that go into that. Some of it's looking for different programs, some of it's geographical. We have a lot of students that live in our district that go to Janesville schools because they live literally in the city of Janesville and prefer that, but there's all kinds of things that go into why someone would choose one school district versus another. But that gap that used to be this big, every year has narrowed to the point that I think it's 13 students now this year. That actually 13 students at the start of the year, and it's narrowed more since the start of the year. So that's part of when I talk about making sure that there's accurate information out there. That's an important part of our story. We are an appealing school district. We hear from the business community that businesses want to locate here because we have strong schools. They can hire employees because their employees can send their kids to high quality schools. That's been happening. You can look at the last 7 of the last 8 years we've gained students. Jeremy, you look like you were anxious to add something to that, or from the high school level? And I'd be glad that we can dig into the numbers more too. On the academic side, we're really proud of what we do, but we match that pride with the humbleness to know that there's things that we can do better. We're proud of the things that we do well. We work hard to identify the things that we can do better, and we push our staff to not only identify things, but to put things in place to do better. Other questions? As some folks are leaving, I want to let you know, feel free to reach out if you get home and think, boy, I got another question, or you're talking to your neighbor and something comes up. We've got a session tomorrow at Harmony Elementary School because we want to catch some people that live down in that area. But at any time over the next month and a half, give me a call or send me an email if there's questions that you have. We'll be happy to answer them by email or invite you in to sit down and visit with you.
Are you gonna post like an FAQ or any kind of thing on the websites?
Yeah, our website has a frequently asked questions page, so if you go to, I'll just toggle back to the presentation because it has the last slide has this slide has the QR code will get you there, or this will get you there. It's the district's website, and then you'll see on our face page, our first page that comes up, there's a operating referendum link. And if you click on that, you'll see a lot of the data that we shared and a frequently asked questions page. Well, we keep updating the frequently
With
asked
all this,
questions
yeah,
page
that's
with
fine.
questions that came up here that aren't already there.
Okay.
And if you look at it and there's things that don't make sense from it, or if it spurs, sometimes a question gets answered and it spurs another question, definitely feel free to reach out and we can either add it to that page or answer it individually.
Okay.
For sure. If there aren't any other questions, thank you all. But if people want to stay and chat for a while, definitely feel free to stay in and board members can answer questions.